Mommy will die renting, that is what my son said to me the night he asked if I could help him with a down payment on his first house. He laughed a little when he said it, like it was just a harmless joke, like 25 years of paying rent somehow made me less than him. I did not argue. I did not defend myself. I just nodded and kept slicing the turkey like I had done every Thanksgiving for the last 3 decades. The knife moved steady through the meat. My hands never shook, but something inside me shifted. Not anger, not even hurt, just a quiet kind of clarity, the kind you get when you finally understand how people see you. I had spent most of my life working jobs that did not come with titles anyone respected. Mornings at a small diner off Route 9 pouring coffee for truck drivers and construction crews. Nights cleaning office buildings downtown after everyone else had gone home. I knew the sound of vacuum cleaners better than I knew silence. I knew what it felt like to count tips at the end of a shift and hope it covered groceries and gas for the week. I rented the same 2-bedroom apartment for 18 years. Beige walls, old carpet, a window that rattled when the wind came through in winter. It was never much, but it was always paid on time. I remembered what it felt like to lose a home. Back in 2008 when everything collapsed, when the mortgage I thought I could handle turned into something I could not survive, I packed my life into boxes and told myself I would never let that happen again, never owe more than I could carry, never trust stability that could disappear overnight. So I rented, and I worked, and I stayed quiet. My daughter-in-law leaned back in her chair that night and said renters do not build wealth, they just survive. She smiled when she said it like she was offering wisdom. My son nodded like he had already accepted that version of me. The woman who worked hard but never got ahead. The woman who would always be just one paycheck away from falling behind. I kept my eyes on my plate and took another bite, because explaining would not have changed anything. They had already decided who I was. And I had already decided I did not need to correct them. Not yet. Later that evening my son brought up the house again. Said he found something just outside the city. 3 bedrooms, good neighborhood. Needed a little work, but it was a smart investment. He asked if I could co-sign or maybe help with a small portion of the down payment, just until things stabilized. I looked at him for a long moment, really looked this time, and I realized he was not trying to insult me earlier. He actually believed it. Believed I had nothing, believed that after all these years I had only managed to survive. I nodded slowly and said we could go talk to the bank in the morning. I would come with him. He seemed relieved, like the problem was already halfway solved. I finished clearing the table, washed the dishes, wiped the counters until everything was clean and quiet again. The apartment felt the same as it always had, small, simple, steady. But for the first time in a long time I felt something different sitting there at the kitchen table. Not shame, not regret, just patience, because I knew something they did not, and tomorrow they were finally going to hear it. The next morning started earlier than usual. I woke up before the alarm like I always did on work days, even though I had taken the day off. Habit does not disappear just because the schedule changes. I made coffee in the same chipped mug I had been using for years, sat at the small kitchen table, and looked around the apartment that had held my life together piece by piece. The walls had seen everything, the late nights, the early mornings, the days I thought I was not going to make it, and the quiet ones where I realized I already had. My son arrived 10 minutes early, which told me more than anything he said. People only rush when they need something. He knocked twice, quick and light, then stepped inside without waiting long, looking around like he had not really seen this place in years. Maybe he had not. Maybe he never cared to. "You ready?" he asked, already checking his phone. I nodded and grabbed my coat, the same coat I had worn through more winters than I could count. We drove in silence at first. The kind that is not uncomfortable but not warm either, just empty space filled with unspoken assumptions. He talked eventually about interest rates, about closing costs, about how everyone his age was getting into the market before it was too late. I listened, not correcting him, not interrupting, just letting him build the picture in his head, the one where he was moving forward and I had stayed behind. The bank was downtown in a newer building with glass walls and clean floors that reflected everything. It smelled like polished surfaces and quiet confidence, the kind of place where people think money lives. We walked up to the front desk and gave his name. The receptionist smiled and asked us to wait. He sat straight in the chair, tapping his foot lightly, already rehearsing what he was going to say. I sat back, hands folded, breathing steady. I had been in banks before, just not like this, not with someone else expecting something from me. When the banker called us in, he greeted my son first, firm handshake, quick smile, then turned to me with polite curiosity. We sat down across from his desk. Papers were spread out neatly, numbers already printed. My son started talking right away, explaining his plan, the house, the loan, how he just needed a little support to make everything work. The banker listened, nodding, typing a few notes. Then he asked a simple question. Would you like to include your mother in the financial review? My son answered, yes, without hesitation, of course. She is helping me. I watched the banker turn the screen slightly. His eyes moved from one column to another. His fingers paused for just a second longer than before. Not enough for someone distracted to notice, but enough for someone who had spent a lifetime watching details. He asked for my identification. I handed it over calmly. No rush, no explanation. He typed again, slower this time, his expression shifting just a little. Not surprise. Exactly, more like recalibration, like the numbers in front of him were not matching the story he had expected. My son kept talking, filling the silence, explaining things that did not need explaining, but the banker was no longer listening to him. His attention was somewhere else now, somewhere behind the screen. I sat still, hands resting lightly on my lap, and for the first time since the night before, I felt something close to certainty settle in my chest, not because I needed to prove anything, but because the truth has a way of arriving on its own time, and when it does not need to be loud, it just needs to be seen. The banker leaned back slightly in his chair and looked at the screen again, then at me, then back at the screen like he was making sure he had not made a mistake. The room felt quieter than before, not empty, just heavier, like something had shifted that no one had named yet. My son was still talking, explaining numbers and plans and timelines, but his voice started to lose its rhythm, like even he could feel something was not lining up the way he expected. The banker raised his hand gently, not rude, just enough to pause the conversation. He turned the monitor a little more toward himself and cleared his throat. Then he spoke slowly, carefully, as if each word needed to be placed exactly right. Ma, can you confirm that you have accounts with our institution under your name? I nodded once. Nothing more. No explanation, no details, just confirmation. He typed again, pulled up another screen, his eyes moving across the data with a focus that had not been there before. My son stopped talking completely now. His body leaned forward slightly, waiting, watching. The banker folded his hands for a second, then opened them again. A small habit maybe, something people do when they are about to say something that changes the direction of a conversation. He turned to my son first, then back to me, and said, your mother's financial profile is already fully established with us. His tone was still professional, but there was something else under it now, something closer to respect. My son frowned a little, like he did not understand the sentence, like it did not connect to the story he had been telling in his head. The banker continued, there would be no need for co-signing in this situation. The assets available under her name exceed the requirements for this type of loan. Several times over, my son blinked, slow at first, then again, like he needed time to catch up to the words. I could see the moment when confusion turned into realization. Not complete yet, but close. The banker clicked once more and the number appeared on his screen. I did not need to look. I had seen it before, many times, always quietly, always alone. But now it was sitting there in front of someone else, not hidden, not explained, just present. He spoke again, this time directly. Your total assets are currently valued at approximately $4.2 million. The sentence did not echo. It did not need to. It landed exactly where it was supposed to. My son leaned back in his chair like something had physically pushed him. His eyes moved from the banker to me and back again, searching for something that made sense, something that matched the version of me he had carried for years. But there was nothing there to support it anymore. I did not smile. I did not react. I simply sat there the same way I had sat at my kitchen table the night before, calm, steady, unchanged, because nothing about me had actually changed, only what they believed had shifted. The banker asked if I would like to proceed with any adjustments or support for my son's application, his tone respectful now, measured. I looked at my son, really looked this time, not as a child I had raised, but as a man who was seeing me for the first time. And in that moment I realized something simple. People do not ignore the truth because it is hidden. They ignore it because it does not fit the story they want to believe, and when that story breaks, it does not shatter loudly. It just disappears, leaving silence behind where certainty used to be. No one spoke for a few seconds after that number settled into the room, not because there was nothing to say, but because there was too much to process at once. My son shifted in his chair, his posture no longer confident, no longer certain. His hands moved slightly like he was about to speak, but could not find the right words. The banker gave a polite pause, the kind professionals use when they understand something personal has just happened. Not on paper, but between people. I reached for my purse slowly and took out a small envelope, worn at the edges from being carried around for years. I placed it gently on the desk, not as a statement, just as something that belonged there now. The banker glanced at it, but did not open it. He did not need to. Everything important was already on the screen. My son finally looked at me fully, his eyes searching my face, not for answers anymore, but for understanding. Like he was trying to find the version of me he thought he knew, the one who struggled, the one who survived paycheck to paycheck. But that version had never been the whole story. It had only been the part he could see. I remembered the years. After everything fell apart, when I worked double shifts without telling anyone how tired I was, when I skipped small comforts so I could build something no one else would notice, when I chose quiet progress over visible success, it was not dramatic. It was not impressive. It was just consistent. Every dollar saved, every expense considered, every decision made with the future in mind instead of the moment. The banker asked softly if there was anything I would like to adjust regarding my accounts, his voice careful, respectful. I shook my head once, no changes. Everything was exactly where it needed to be. My son let out a breath he did not realize he had been holding, a small sound, but enough to show the shift inside him. He leaned forward again, slower this time, and asked how, just one word, no accusation, no disbelief, just a question that finally mattered. I looked at him and answered simply, I did not spend what I did not have, and I stayed patient. That was all. He nodded, not fully understanding yet, but beginning to see the outline of something different, something that did not fit the world he was used to. We finished the meeting without much else being said. The banker provided options, numbers, possibilities, but none of it felt urgent anymore. Outside the building the air felt cooler, quieter, like the city was moving at its normal pace while something between us had slowed down. We stood by the car for a moment, neither of us rushing to leave. He looked at me again, not with doubt this time, but with something closer to respect, or maybe recognition, and in that moment I realized that the most powerful changes do not happen when you prove someone wrong. They happen when you allow them to see what was always there, without needing to explain it at all. We drove back in silence, not the same silence as before. This one felt different, heavier but clearer, like something invisible had been moved out of the way. And now there was nothing left to hide behind. My son kept his hands on the wheel, eyes forward, but I could see the way his grip tightened and loosened, like he was trying to steady himself from something he did not expect to feel. He finally spoke halfway through the drive, not looking at me, asking how long had it been like that? I answered simply, a long time, longer than you think. He nodded slowly, like he was counting backwards through years in his head, trying to place moments that now felt different. The apartment came into view, the same building, the same parking lot with faded lines and uneven pavement. Nothing about it had changed, and yet everything had shifted. We sat in the car for a moment before getting out, neither of us in a hurry. He looked at the building, then back at me, and asked why I stayed here, not accusing, just trying to understand. I shrugged slightly and said it was enough, and it always had been inside the Apartment. The air felt familiar, steady, untouched by what had happened. I hung my coat in the same place and moved toward the kitchen without thinking. Routine has a way of grounding everything. He followed slowly, looking around like he was seeing the space for the first time, not just the furniture or the walls, but the life inside it, the choices, the discipline, the years that had passed quietly without recognition. He sat at the table while I poured 2 cups of coffee. The same way I always did, nothing special, just warm and simple. He held the cup but did not drink, his mind somewhere else, trying to connect what he had seen with what he thought he knew. I did not rush him. Some things take time to settle. He asked another question, softer this time. Why did you never tell me? I looked at him and answered the same way I had lived all those years. I did not need to. He frowned slightly, not in disagreement, just in realization, like he was beginning to understand that not everything important is meant to be explained. Sometimes it is just meant to be lived. I thought about the nights I came home late, tired but still setting aside a small amount, the mornings I chose not to spend on things that would have made the day easier, but the future weaker. None of it looked impressive from the outside. It looked like sacrifice, like limitation, like staying stuck. But it was never about appearances. It was about control, about making sure that no matter what happened, I would never be forced into a position I could not handle again. My son set the cup down slowly and looked at me differently now. Not as someone who had less, but as someone who had chosen a different path, one he had not seen because he had been looking for something louder, something visible, something that matched what everyone else was chasing. I sat across from him, hands resting calmly on the table, and for the first time there was no distance between what he saw and what was real, not because I had changed anything, but because he had finally stopped assuming and started seeing, and that was something no amount of money could buy. It only came with time, and sometimes, with being proven wrong in the quietest possible way. He stayed longer than I expected that afternoon, not talking much, just sitting at the table like he was trying to rearrange years of assumptions into something that made sense. I moved through the apartment the way I always did, wiping the counter, folding a towel, small things that did not need attention, but gave my hands something to do while the silence settled. After a while he stood up and walked toward the window, looking out at the parking lot where nothing ever really changed. Same cars, same spaces, same routine. He asked quietly if I ever planned to leave this place, not with judgment this time, just curiosity. I took a moment before answering, not because I needed to think, but because I wanted the answer to be clear. I told him I could leave any time I wanted, but I chose not to. He turned back to me with a slight frown, like that idea did not fit into anything he had learned. I explained simply that freedom is not always about upgrading. Sometimes it is about not needing to, about knowing you have options and deciding you do not need to prove them to anyone. He nodded slowly, absorbing it in pieces, the way people do when they are hearing something that sounds simple but feels unfamiliar. Later that evening his phone rang, and I could tell from his tone it was his wife. His voice shifted, more controlled, more careful. He stepped into the hallway to talk, but the apartment is small and voices carry even when you try to lower them. I did not hear every word, but I heard enough. The questions, the disbelief, the attempt to turn something unexpected into something that could be explained away. He came back a few minutes later and sat down again, this time more grounded, like the outside conversation had not changed what he already knew inside. He looked at me and said she did not believe it at first. I nodded, not surprised. People often resist what does not match their expectations, especially when it challenges something they have been saying for years. He asked if I was going to tell anyone else, friends, family, anyone. I shook my head, no reason to. Nothing had changed except what people thought, and I had never lived based on that. He leaned back in the chair and let out a long breath, not frustration, more like release, like something heavy had been set down. We sat there quietly for a while, not uncomfortable, just still. And I realized something in that moment. The money had never been the point, not the number, not the accounts, not the accumulation. It was what it represented. Years of discipline no one applauded, choices no one noticed, Sacrifices that looked like limitations from the outside, but were actually structure. I had never needed validation for it because I had never built it for anyone else. My son finally stood up to leave, slower than when he arrived, more deliberate. He paused at the door and looked back at me, not with confusion anymore, not even with surprise, just with a kind of respect that had not been there before, quiet but real, and I understood then that the biggest change had not happened at the bank. It had happened here, in this small apartment, in the space where assumptions had been replaced with understanding, and for the first time in a long time, there was nothing left that needed to be proven. The next few days moved differently. Not slower exactly, but more intentional, like each moment carried a little more weight than before. My son started calling more often. Not about money, not about the house, just small things, asking how my day was, telling me about work, things he had not shared in years. At first it felt unusual, like he was trying to correct something without saying it out loud, but over time it settled into something more natural. Something closer to what it used to be before assumptions took the place of understanding. One evening he stopped by again, not in a rush this time, not with an agenda, just a quiet knock and a simple hello. He brought groceries, nothing extravagant. Just a few things he knew I liked: fresh fruit, coffee, bread from the bakery down the street. I noticed it immediately, not because of the items, but because of the thought behind them. People do not change their habits overnight, but they do change their attention when something inside them shifts. We sat at the table again, the same place where everything had started to change, and he asked if I would ever consider helping him in a different way, not with money, but with advice, how I managed to stay consistent, how I made decisions when things were uncertain. I listened carefully, because the question mattered more than the answer. It meant he was no longer looking for a shortcut, he was looking for understanding. I told him the truth the same way I always had, simple, steady, without trying to impress. I said it was never about making big moves, it was about making small ones over and over again, even when no one noticed. Especially when no one noticed. He nodded slowly, taking it in, not arguing, not comparing, just listening. Later that night his wife called again, this time on speaker, her tone softer than before, not skeptical, just cautious. She asked a few questions, not about the amount, but about how, and for the first time I answered a little more, not everything. Just enough. I explained that I had learned early that stability comes from what you keep, not what you show, that comfort does not always look like success from the outside, but it feels like control on the inside. There was a pause on the line, then a quiet acknowledgement, not an apology, but something close to it, something that did not need to be said directly to be understood. After the call ended, the apartment felt calm again, familiar, unchanged in every visible way, but different in the way it held the conversation that had just happened. My son looked around once more, not with surprise anymore, but with appreciation, like he finally understood that this place was never a limitation, it was a choice, a foundation, a space where discipline had been built quietly without needing recognition. He stood up to leave again, but this time there was no hesitation, no uncertainty, just a clear sense of direction, as if something had been reset inside him. And as I watched him walk out the door, I realized that the most valuable thing I had ever built was not in any account or statement. It was the ability to stay steady when everything else felt uncertain, and now, for the first time, he was starting to build that too. The following week felt different in a way that was not obvious from the outside. Nothing about my routine changed. I still woke up early, still made coffee in the same chipped mug, still walked past the same hallway light that flickered if you did not switch it just right, but something inside the space had shifted, not louder, not brighter, just clearer. My son came by again on a Sunday afternoon, this time with his wife. She stood at the doorway for a second longer than necessary before stepping inside, like she was adjusting to something she could not see but could feel. She smiled politely, not the same confident smile from before. This one was softer, more measured. I nodded and welcomed her in the same way I always had, no change in tone, no change in posture, because there was no reason to treat her differently now. People reveal themselves over time, but how you respond does not have to follow their pace. We sat together at the table, 3 cups of coffee this time. The conversation started slowly, simple things, work, weather, small updates that filled the space without pressure, but underneath it all there was a different awareness. A quiet acknowledgement of what had been said before and what had been learned since. She eventually asked about how I decided where to invest, her voice careful, not challenging, just genuinely curious. I answered the same way I had answered everything else. Without trying to impress, I said I never chased anything I did not understand. I stayed with what I could follow, what made sense over time, not overnight. She nodded, absorbing it, not arguing, not comparing, just listening. My son watched the exchange without interrupting, like he understood that this moment was not about proving anything, it was about learning something he had overlooked for years. Later they mentioned the house again, not with urgency this time, not as something they needed to rush into, but as something they wanted to think through carefully. He said he realized now that buying something just to keep up with everyone else did not mean it was the right time. I could hear the difference in his voice, less pressure, more clarity. I nodded once, because that was the only response it needed. Decisions are stronger when they come from understanding rather than reaction. Before they left, she paused at the door and looked back at the apartment, not with judgment this time, but with something closer to respect. She said it felt calm here. I told her it always had been. She smiled slightly and said she could see that now. After they left, the apartment returned to its usual quiet, the same steady rhythm, the same familiar stillness. But the conversations that had passed through it lingered in a different way, not heavy, not unresolved, just settled. I sat at the table again, hands resting lightly on the surface, and thought about how easily people confuse appearance with reality. How quickly they measure success by what can be seen instead of what is built over time. Nothing about my life had changed in the way they used to define it. I still rented, still lived simply, still moved through each day without showing more than I needed to. But now there was no misunderstanding left in the room, only clarity, and that kind of clarity does not need to be repeated. It only needs to be understood once. After that, everything else adjusts on its own time, moved forward the way it always does. Quietly, without asking for permission, the seasons shifted outside the apartment window, the air turned colder, then warmer again, and life settled into a rhythm that felt familiar, but clearer than before. My son did not rush into buying a house after that day. He took his time, looked at numbers differently, asked questions he had never asked before, not just about what he could afford, but about what he actually needed. And that change was more important than any decision he could have made quickly. He came by one evening with a folder in his hand, not to ask for help this time, but to show me what he had been working on, budgets, projections, different scenarios laid out carefully, not perfect, but thoughtful. I looked through it slowly, nodding where it made sense, pointing out a few places where patience might serve him better than urgency. He listened, not defensive, not rushed, just steady, like he understood that building something real does not come from trying to impress anyone else. His wife joined him a few minutes later, bringing dinner with her, simple food, nothing elaborate, but it was not about the meal, it was about the gesture, the way they moved in the space now, comfortable, respectful, aware of what this place represented. Not limitation, but foundation. We ate together at the same table where everything had shifted weeks before, the conversation easy, unforced. She spoke about cutting back on things they did not need, about focusing on stability instead of appearances, her tone calm, not performative, and I could hear the difference, not because of what she said, but because of how she said it. After dinner they gathered their things to leave, but this time there was no weight in the air, no unfinished thoughts. Just a quiet sense of direction. My son paused at the door again, something he seemed to do now out of habit. He looked back at me and said he finally understood something that had been right in front of him all along. That wealth is not what people show, it is what they keep. I nodded once, because that was enough. Words do not need to be repeated when they are understood. After they left, the apartment returned to its usual stillness, the same quiet hum of the refrigerator, the same soft light through the window. Nothing had changed in the way it would appear to anyone passing by, but everything had settled into its place. I sat at the table for a moment, hands resting lightly, thinking about the years that had brought me here. Not the money, not the accounts, but the choices, the consistency, the discipline that had never needed an audience. I had never tried to prove anything, never needed to correct what people assumed, because in the end, truth does not depend on recognition. It exists whether anyone sees it or not, and when it finally becomes visible, it does not need to announce itself. It simply stands there, quiet, steady, undeniable, just like it always has been.